Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with the last lecture for Anatomy and Physiology 2 Circulatory System. And in this lecture, I'm going to summarize the disorders that we've talked about throughout the unit. Also, I'd like to let you know that you have study questions related to this topic. Study question number 17. It's entitled Circulatory Disorders and Disease States, and to help you kind of organize this material, I've put together a partial answer key with references to all the lectures that we've gone through throughout the semester. So look for that on Blackboard. So let's first start with disorders related to blood and all the blood lectures that we had. We had some related to what's in the plasma, and that would be the plasma proteins in particular that we talked about. And we know that the liver is responsible for making several plasma proteins, albumin, clotting factors, and several others. So if there's liver disease, then you'll have a decrease in the plasma protein concentration. Now, there can also be a decrease in the plasma protein concentration due to dietary constraints. Regardless, that both of those lead to what we call hypoproteinemia. So we're going to look at that disorder. And then we also talked about some disorders related to erythrocytes and erythropoiesis. In particular, we discussed polycythemia vera, which is an increased red blood cell count and mass resulting in a high hematocrit due to the fact that there's a problem with the bone marrow, and so more red blood cells are produced. In addition, another couple of disorders that we talked about related to erythrocytes are anemia. One cause is iron deficiency, and the other cause would be a sickle cell genetic disorder. Regardless, anemia is defined as the inability of the blood to sufficiently carry oxygen. So we'll look at that. Also, we looked at a couple, not seriously, but a little bit, a couple definitions anyway, related to disorders with leukocytes. We defined leukopenia, leukocytosis, and the disorder we discussed is leukemia, which is a bone marrow cancer. And then we also talked about clotting deficiencies, the inability for the blood to clot when needed. That could be due to liver disease as well, because the liver makes clotting factors. But it could also be due to a genetic disorder referred to as hemophilia. And remember, the technical term for clotting is coagulation, which I should have written. So I'm going to start with what we talked about regarding the plasma protein disorders and hypoproteinemia. Okay, so here are here's a picture that shows the blood and the tissues and how there's an exchange of fluid between the plasma and the interstitial fluid, or the space between the systemic cells. And in order for osmosis to occur correctly, we have to have enough plasma proteins, and 60% of the plasma proteins are albumin. Okay, so albumin's the most prevalent. If we have low plasma proteins, then the blood has less osmolarity. And so osmosis will occur in the direction of the tissues. And so what you get is edema, or swelling of the tissues. So that's one slide that we talked about or looked at. But then we also discussed hypoproteinemia in a malnutrition case, okay, or starvation. So this would be kwashiorkor disease, and that's due to a diet that is rich in carbohydrate but deficient or deficient in protein. And so what we see is we do see edema developing in the tissues. These are children that are receiving a diet high in carbohydrate, particularly rice. And so they get muscular atrophy. The arms and the legs are really spindly, but we do see the edema, but it for some reason builds up in the abdomen. And we refer to that abdominal edema as ascites. Now, of course, just low caloric intake can also cause a very serious nutritional disorder, but this isn't really related to plasma protein concentration. Just you end up with overall emaciation in all the tissues, so you don't see edema. Okay, now let's look at some erythrocyte disorders that we talked about. The first one I'll discuss is polycythemia vera, and the other is anemia. So I'm going to talk about polycythemia first. Polycythemia, just that word alone, means increased red blood cell count, which would result in a high hematocrit as well. Now there's a lot of causes for high red blood cell counts. One could be this bone marrow cancer that I'm going to talk about. It's called polycythemia vera. But other things consider to an increased red blood cell count. The body's response to low oxygen is to increase erythropoiesis. So if we have low oxygen due to lung disease like COPD or a lung cancer or chronic sleep apnea, or I guess less serious is exposure to a high altitude where the atmosphere contains less O2. But also if the hemoglobin is abnormal and can't carry oxygen, then you'll see increased red blood cell counts even though the hemoglobin will still be abnormal. So polycythemia will give you a high hematocrit, okay? But so will polycythemia vera will give you a high hematocrit or increased red blood cell numbers. But so can iron deficiency anemia. Now, sickle cell anemia typically doesn't because the sickle cells are destroyed. So let's look at first polycythemia's problem. Why is that a big deal? Well, you might also get a decrease in white blood cell count because it depends on which white blood cell you're talking about, but increased erythropoiesis might prevent the bone marrow from producing certain types of white blood cells. So like the red blood cells replace the white blood cells, so to speak. In addition, if you have chronic polycythemia for whatever reason, that might increase your blood volume, making it more viscous and lead to vessel obstructions. If you have an obstruction in a vessel leading to the brain, you could end up with a stroke. That's what a stroke is. Or if you have an obstruction in a vessel that's in the coronary circulation, then you might get a myocardial infarction in the heart, which we'll talk about later. In addition, you could have increased blood pressure, which could eventually lead to problems with the heart. Now, anemia. Anemia is the inability of blood to adequately carry oxygen, and that could be due to the fact that there are too few red blood cells, or that the hemoglobin in the red blood cells is abnormal, or there isn't enough. Okay. Now, why would you have low red blood cells? Well, it could be due to hemorrhage, so you lose blood. It could be due to the fact that you're not making adequate red blood cells or adequate hemoglobin, so oxygen isn't being delivered. This is where iron deficiency anemia would be placed in inadequate hemoglobin production. You could also have anemia due to increased hemolysis. So this is what occurs with sickle cell anemia. The abnormal sickle-shaped red blood cells are destroyed. Okay. Now, in compensation, well, first, the complication to anemia is that the tissues experience hypoxia, low oxygen. But the body could compensate by increasing the heart rate, and the term for that is tachycardia. Okay. Another complication is that it occurs with hemorrhagic or hemolytic anemia, and that would be if the red blood cell count or the blood volume is reduced significantly, your blood pressure could drop. You could also end up with edema in the systemic tissues or the lungs if you have a low red blood cell count, because the osmolarity of the blood would be lower. But in most cases of chronic anemia, the body compensates by increasing erythropoiesis, and so you'll actually see high red blood cell counts, or a type of polycythemia. Now, we discussed sickle cell anemia, and that is a genetic disorder. And in that case, an individual has 2 copies of an abnormal hemoglobin gene, and that gene is named HbS, referring to sickle cell. This hemoglobin doesn't bind oxygen very well. In addition, the cells become stiff because of the shape of the hemoglobin, presumably, and sickle-shaped. And they can get stuck in a vessel and block blood vessels. But in addition, when they go through the spleen, they'll rupture and they'll be destroyed through hemolysis. Here's an example I wanted to show you about the complication or the complicated diagnosis when somebody has a high hematocrit. So this paper reports a case where it's from 2016 where a patient had high hemoglobin, high hematocrit, right? High red blood cells, and also they looked at oxygen saturation, and they looked at blood gases, and they saw low O2. So they see all these high red blood cell numbers and they see low O2. So they thought originally it was iron deficiency anemia, because that's what would happen with iron deficiency anemia. If the hemoglobin doesn't have iron, the iron can't bind oxygen, and if you don't have oxygen, erythropoiesis is stimulated, and so you get all these high red blood cell counts. But through a series of complicated tests that we don't really need to go through, I don't think, the patient was finally diagnosed with a bone marrow disorder, polycythemia vera. So that's why they say it was masked, because there were some lab tests that turned out similar for both of these disorders, iron deficiency anemia and polycythemia. So that's why it's hard to answer and ask questions about red blood cells. Okay, let's look at leukocyte disorders. They're a lot simpler. We know that a normal leukocyte count is between 5,000 and 10,000 cells per microliter. And the term for a low white blood cell count is leukopenia. And the term for a high white blood cell count would be leukocytosis. Now, why would white blood cells be destroyed or low in number? Heavy metal poisoning, radiation sickness. Some viral infections decrease certain types of white blood cells. And then also people that are being treated for transplants take immunosuppressants, one of which might be a glucocorticoid, like a steroid type thing, and that would decrease leukophoresis. And also anti-cancer agents, which decrease the amount of cell mitosis. In general, white blood cells form by a process similar to mitosis, so white blood cell numbers would be down. For leukocytosis, why would you have a high white blood cell count? Well, the most obvious is infection, right? And we know that depending on the type of infection, there'll be different kinds of white blood cells that are increased. In addition, you could have leukemia. That's the other disorder we talked about, which is a bone marrow cancer. And in that case, leukophoresis is unregulated. So we're going to look at leukemia very briefly here. So it's unregulated leukophoresis. So the bone marrow becomes abnormal, no longer responding to signals to produce white blood cells. It just automatically produces lots of white blood cells. So it's unregulated mitosis as well, and maturation of white blood cells. And unfortunately, because it's a cancer, these abnormal stem cells in the bone marrow replace normal bone marrow cells. And you end up with lots of white blood cells that are immature and defective. Now, that could result in a deficiency in red blood cell production or in certain types of white blood cells. It depends on the type of leukemia. And of course, a complication to leukemia is that you can't fight infection as well. And so a person is said to succumb to opportunistic infections by bacteria and viruses primarily. Okay, and then the last type of disorder that we talked about in relation to blood is a coagulation or clotting disorder. And there's several liver diseases that could impair coagulation because it's the liver that makes the clotting factors required. Some of these liver diseases include hepatitis, which is an inflammatory disease, cirrhosis, which is a destructive disease, and liver cancer, which I'm not all that familiar with, but presumably the cells are abnormal and not making clotting factors. So if you don't have clotting factors, or at least not the right ones, you're not going to be able to clot your blood. This is also true in a set of hereditary diseases called hemophilia. Now, in this case, the liver's fine, but the clotting factor, each clotting factor is coded for by a gene. And that gene codes for a protein that the liver makes. So the gene is in a cell in the liver, and the liver cell interprets the code and makes the clotting factor. If that gene is abnormal, then it's mutated. And there's different hemophilias with these abnormal clotting factor genes. So in hemophilia A, a person's gene for clotting factor 8 is abnormal. In hemophilia B, a person's gene for clotting factor 9 is abnormal. And then there's another one, C. And these genes are on different chromosomes. Okay, so hemophilia would result in not producing the clotting factors necessary to produce the fibrin, which is the clotting protein. Not a clotting factor, but the protein that all the blood cells stick to and forms the clot. There was another disorder, but it wasn't in your study questions. It has to do with platelets not adhering to a damaged vessel correctly, so you wouldn't even really get a good platelet plug. And it's a genetic disorder as well, and it's called von Willebrand disease. So that pretty much sums up all the disorders related to any of the blood lectures. Now I'm going to move on to disorders related to the heart lectures. Okay, there's fewer here. Myocardial infarction and the importance of the coronary circulation. I'm going to talk about that, review it. And then heart murmurs, which is all due to valve function. I'll discuss that. Congestive heart failure, and finally I'll mention circulatory shock, but that really belongs with blood vessels, and we'll see why in a little bit. So let's start with a myocardial infarction and identify what it even is. You're familiar with this idea of a heart attack. That's what myocardial infarction means, I guess. In layman's terms, we say heart attack. And you know that people experience chest pain. The term for that is angina pectoris. And the chest pain is thought to be due to a lack of oxygen in the heart muscle and lactic acid buildup. Now, what can cause this lack of oxygen? Well, let's talk about the coronary circulation for a minute. The coronary circulation is a set of vessels that supplies, particularly the arterial portion, that supplies oxygen-rich blood to the heart muscle. Now, we know that all these arteries surrounding the heart muscle interconnect, and there are several anastomoses or multiple supplies to a region of the heart to make sure that if a little bit of blood supply is cut off somewhere, the heart muscle in that region will still get oxygenated blood. So these anastomoses are anatomical features of the arterial supply. If for some reason the heart muscle does not receive oxygenated blood, we say that it experiences ischemia, or the tissue becomes ischemic. So ischemia means a lack of oxygen. If ischemia continues for any period of time, the cells may die, so tissue death may occur. And the term for tissue death is necrosis, although I don't think that's in your study questions. So if you have part of the heart that has died or become necrotic, then you can end up with an infarct. So an infarct is an area of tissue death due to long-term ischemia. And so that's one disorder that we talked about. And the result would be insufficient ventricular contraction, most likely. And so you'll have a change in cardiac output, which we'll come back to in a little bit. Let's move on to heart murmurs, because that was the second disorder that we talked about, heart murmurs. These heart murmurs are abnormal heart sounds. Okay, we normally hear lub-dub, 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 two heart sounds, S1 and S2. But when the blood flow is turbulent or partially obstructed, then we've got another sound, either a swishing or a clicking. And most of the time that indicates a problem with a heart valve. So there's two basic categories of valve disorders that can cause heart murmurs. One is when the valve is insufficient or incompetent. It won't close correctly. And so you'll get blood flowing through the valve backwards. And it forms this swishing sound. I'll show you a picture in a second. An example would be valvular prolapse. It's one example of an insufficient valve. Another example is valvular stenosis. Generally, although it could be failure to close properly as well, but generally speaking, this makes a valve fail to open properly. So blood can go through it, but not very well. There's obstruction or restriction, and so you hear this clicking. Now, I'm going to show you some pictures, and you'll say that valvular stenosis could also cause the swishing, and I'll have to agree with you on that. But anyway, so here's two different examples. A valve prolapse. This is the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And when this left ventricle contracts and blood is going to squirt out the aorta, hopefully, some blood is able to go backwards into the left atrium because the bicuspid valve did not close properly. And in that instance, you'd hear a kind of a swishing, a turbulence, as the blood regurgitates into the inappropriate chamber. Now, on the right is a picture of a valve that's stenotic. Okay, and this stenotic business means hardening, I guess. Calcium is due to the calcium deposits which have developed on the valve. And so the valves become stiff and they don't open properly. Now, it's probably true they don't close properly well either. So you might get the regurgitation business, but even forward flow is difficult. So let's just say it's from, again, the left ventricle into the aorta. Then that narrowed opening through the semilunar valve would make the blood kind of click as it goes past the valve. It's kind of weird. So both with valve disorders or with myocardial infarction, you could have a problem with cardiac output. And let me explain what I mean. We measured cardiac output as heart rate times stroke volume. And generally speaking, cardiac output in a healthy heart is equal on both the left side and the right side, right? Same amount of blood is pumped per minute on both sides of the heart. But if you have a valve problem that's making it hard for one of the ventricles to pump blood out, or if you have some dead tissue decreasing the contractility of the heart, then cardiac output will be diminished on that side. And when cardiac output is unequal side to side, it can result in what's known as congestive heart failure. And this term congestive refers to the fact that the blood backs up. In addition, we see edema forming. I guess that's a kind of congestion too. So let's just say that if you have left-sided failure here in this part, the cardiac output is reduced. Okay, so the flow is reduced out of the aorta, but the reason is because the blood stays in the ventricle and you get backfilling into the atrium and to the pulmonary veins, resulting in swelling in the lungs. If instead you have right-sided heart failure, then after systole is complete, the right ventricle is still full of blood, or at least has too much in it. And so blood backs up or congests the right atrium, the vena cava, all the way to the systemic tissues. And so that blood is pooling in the systemic tissues instead of in the lung tissue. And so you get systemic edema. So with right-sided failure, you get systemic edema. With left-sided failure, think L, you get lung edema. Okay. And I just wanted to briefly show you a picture of the slides that were in those lectures because it goes through it in a little bit more detail. and I think the pictures are a little bit better to explain left-sided congestive heart failure versus right-sided. Okay, so the causes of congestive heart failure, as I mentioned, might be due to some sort of a valve disorder, hypertension in the vessels. The vessels might have high pressure due to arteriosclerosis or something. But it could also be due to low venous return on one side but not the other, and contractility issues. So there's a lot of reasons that congestive heart failure can occur. The simplest one to think about is myocardial infarction. Part of the tissue's dead, so that ventricle's not pumping very hard. Okay, that's a nice segue into the concept of hypertension, which is really blood vessel disorder related, not heart related, but it has an impact on the heart. And so that's what I wanted to mention. Chronic hypertension increases the afterload on the heart. It makes it hard for the ventricles to pump blood out, either due to, a valve problem, like an aortic valve stenosis, or due to arterial thickening of the wall, the tunica media, that would produce hypertension as well. So the afterload has increased drastically and the heart has to work really hard. Okay, now we're going to talk about the blood vessel disorders that were discussed in our lectures, and we've already talked about a couple of them, but I'll just mention them again. So the disorders in blood vessel lectures include arteriosclerosis or atherosclerosis, hypertension, chronic hypertension, a shock, which will lead to cardiac output. It's called vascular circulatory shock, an aneurysm in a vessel, and varicose veins. So quite a few disorders related to blood vessel health. So let's look at arteriosclerosis first. So arteriosclerosis is a thickening of the tunica intima or tunica media, the inner two layers of the blood vessel wall. And that thickening causes a stiffening and the arteries become less elastic. So they're less compliant to surges in blood pressure and unable to recoil as well. And so the blood flow is more turbulent through the arteries, resistance is increased, blood pressure gets higher, but the bottom line is the heart has to work harder to maintain blood flow. That's only slightly different than atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is a term used for the buildup of obstructions in the lumen. So less about the wall, more about the lumen of the blood vessel. Although these plaques that build up usually start at the wall and move to the middle. But of course you'd have the same problems, right? Blood flow is inhibited, the heart has to work harder. Okay, now hypertension, let's define it. Hypertension is defined as chronic high blood pressure. And the numeric value of that is 140 systolic over 90 diastolic. And this can be due to vascular conditions that we've already talked about. It can be due to lung dysfunction, which leads to polycythemia, so more viscous blood. But it can also be due to kidney disease, the inability to filter wastes out of the blood. So overall, the blood experiences more resistance either due to its own composition or friction against the wall of the vessel. And that places afterload on the heart. So let's look at primary hypertension a little bit more. There was a slide that relates to primary hypertension, and I think this was actually in a heart lecture, but it might have been in a blood vessel lecture. So we know that primary hypertension, high blood pressure, causes increased afterload on the heart. Over time, the heart will experience hypertrophy, meaning the wall will get thicker. Over time, this thick wall will become inefficient and it could lead to heart failure. Okay. That's of course not the only problem. There are problems with vessels too. You can get tears and lesions and weakening and thickening, and ultimately the problem is ischemia of the tissues. So the risk factors of primary hypertension are obesity. I think I can check all these off except for the last one. So I have risk factors: obesity, sedentary behavior, okay, not emotional tension. Well, stress, emotional tension, what you eat, oh, my diet's okay, and nicotine. Smoking causes hypertension. It has to do with the level of cholesterol, HDL and LDL in your blood. So primary hypertension is very bad for your heart. Now let's look at aneurysms. Aneurysms are a weak point in an artery, usually the tunica media, and that weakness forms a bulge. And the blood then flows between the tunica media and the tunica externa, usually. Now, what are the causes? Well, it could be a connective tissue disorder such as Marfan syndrome. There is a host of connective tissue disorders that are genetically inherited that can cause a problem with blood vessels, particularly the aorta. Trauma could cause it. Sometimes a bacterial infection. That would be a pretty serious bacterial infection resulting in what we call sepsis, infection in the blood. And then atherosclerosis, a plaque buildup, can result in a weak point in an artery, and so can hypertension. Okay, our last disorder is varicose veins. Oh no, it's not our last disorder. Sorry, almost. Varicose veins. Varicose veins, you can usually see through the skin. This vein is called the saphenous vein down in the calf, and they look enlarged and distended. The reason they're distended is because there's been venous blood pooling. And so you know that veins are capacitance vessels, and they widen when the blood pools in them, and the valves get stretched apart so that they no longer prevent backflow. So the blood will flow backwards instead of the way it's supposed to, which is superiorly in this leg vein. So you get a weakening of the wall, distension of the vein, and maybe even rupture. This causes pain, but it also causes swelling in the tissues, edema, because the blood is sitting here pooling in the veins. And the risk factors for developing this is partly hereditary, okay, but also long periods of standing don't help, obesity, and related to that would be pregnancy, because you're putting a lot of weight on the lower extremities, and that can lead to venous pooling. Okay, now we have disorders related to just the capillary beds. Okay, just the capillary beds. And so capillary fluid dynamics is what we discussed. The exchange of fluid between the blood and tissues. And there's two disorders that change the dynamics or the fluid movement at the capillary beds. And these aren't new disorders. It's just that we're going to be looking at what's happening at the capillary bed. in hypertension and in hypoproteinemia, low protein in the blood. So we'll do hypertension first and look at why it causes a problem of fluid movement in the capillary beds. Okay, so recall that hypertension is defined as a high blood pressure chronically over 140 systolic. And this high blood pressure is experienced, maybe not all the way to 140, but it's experienced at the arterial end of a capillary bed as well as at the venous end of the capillary bed. So both ends are going to have high hydrostatic pressure. That's a force of filtration, water leaving the blood. And because it also is happening at the venous end, you're going to have less reabsorption. And instead you'll have some filtration that you normally wouldn't see. So you get increased filtration of the blood, more water escaping out of the blood, and less reabsorption. And so what you see is systemic edema. Now let's look at how hypoproteinemia, I'm going to try that one more time. Hypoproteinemia results in systemic edema. In this case, you have low plasma proteins. And so the blood has a lower osmotic pressure. Now remember where that osmotic pressure was most important was in the reabsorption of fluid. It also, the osmotic pressure also reduces how much fluid is net filtered out, but it's really at the venous end that this is the most important region. So you will have a little bit of increased filtration, but mostly you have less reabsorption of water, and so you end up with systemic edema. Okay, there are other causes for systemic edema not related to the circulatory system. One would be blockage of lymphatic vessels. So when we talk about the lymphatic system, edema will come back. Liver disease, that only makes sense because you'd have less plasma proteins. But also kidney disease could produce systemic edema. So when we talk about the urinary system, that'll pop up. And inflammation, which we'll talk about when we do resistance and immunity, increases the permeability of capillaries, and so you get swelling with inflammation. And then we talked, of course, about incompetent venous valves, like happens with varicose veins, and we talked about congestive heart failure, causing a backup of blood, and in right-sided you get systemic edema. So those are a lot of disorders for the circulatory system and somewhat interrelated. I'm hoping you find that information is helpful. Thank you.